recording. If anyone is not comfortable being recorded, you can turn your camera off. That would be just fine. Okay, I'm seeing a minute after, so we'll go ahead and get started here. So again, welcome to our Resilience Through Connection series. We're so happy to have you here. My name is Jessica Reiswig. I'm the Project Echo Director, and I will be your facilitator today. So this series is sponsored by North Dakota State Suicide Prevention Program and funded by the North Dakota Department of Health and Human Services, the Behavioral Health Division. Resilience Through Connection ECHO focuses on the factors that shape social connection and loneliness while sharing practical strategies to build skills, build resilience, and meaningful relationships. We are open to everyone, but our series does have a special focus on those supporting individuals with disabilities and those at a higher risk for mental health challenges. Our series also highlights protective factors in suicide prevention. We focus on the importance of connection, and we share resources that we hope will make people feel more connected and supported. Your participation is essential to the success of our ECHO sessions. Our goal is to create an interactive community where everyone connects, learns from one another, and supports each other. We encourage you to stay engaged, be present, and share your thoughts. Your feedback is incredibly valuable in what builds our community of practice. Feel free to put any questions in the chat at any time. We will monitor those during the presentation and we'll address them during designated periods. Our sessions are recorded for educational purposes. Like I said before, if you're not comfortable with being recorded, you can keep your camera off, that's fine. We also have case narratives in some of our sessions. So if you have a case you'd like to present, or if you want us to anonymously present one on your behalf, please reach out to us and we would be more than happy to accommodate that. For confidentiality, privacy is essential. Please avoid using any real names or identifying details about individuals or their contacts. This helps maintain a safe and respectful environment for everyone. You can earn professional development credits in social work or peer support by attending our sessions. To receive credit, complete the evaluation shared in the chat, or it's also in iEcho after the session. We have that link there. Sessions must be attended live online to qualify. Some quick housekeeping. Zoom links are emailed about an hour before each session. If you don't receive that email, please reach out to us, or you can log into your account on iEcho and access that Zoom link there. Recordings, slides, certificates, and resources will be posted in iEcho within about a week of this session. One last housekeeping reminder is for everyone to keep their microphones muted during the presentation. And also we want this to be a safe and welcoming space for everyone. So we encourage open dialogue, but we ask that everyone keep all comments and questions professional and respectful. And now I am so pleased to introduce our speaker for today, Renee Cardarell. I will go ahead and stop sharing and let them take over.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for coming today. I was asked to do a presentation on the connection between polarization and loneliness. And so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Please bear with me if we have any technical, glitches. And of course, right away, my internet's unstable. So hopefully I won't freeze at any point in time. So I will go ahead and give a little more explanation of who I am in a few minutes. But before I do that, I wanted to share this quote with you. We are born alone, we live alone, we die alone. Only through our love and friendship can we create the illusion for the moment that we are not alone. Orson Welles. We're going to be talking about loneliness, deep chronic loneliness. And as humans, when we're born, we are alone. We are not part of a hive mind, so to speak. If you know Star Trek, had I forget their names, but they had this hive mind where they could share and they felt connected to each other. We don't have that. We're very alone inside our own bodies. But we thrive in community. So that's the contradiction of humans, right? That we have our own selves that we are very isolated inside of, but we do our best when we are embedded deeply inside of a community. And I have a picture of a honeybee here because hive bees have this characteristic that if they are removed from or separated from the hive, they'll die within a week or two, maybe. They just simply cannot live outside of the hive. They need the hive to stay alive. And I did learn at one point that there are bees that can be independent and don't have hives, but hive bees in particular have to have that hive. And I always thought humans were a little bit like hive bees. We do not flourish if we're not inside of our communities. If you take a person outside of their community and they are living on their own, let's say isolated in the woods, they don't thrive. They can exist, and sometimes people can live for years that way, but a lot of times they're not very mentally healthy. And they need that interaction of people. So even those who choose to kind of live off grid often will have their ways of interconnecting or coming back to being around other humans. I mean, there's the very bare fact of if you fall and break a leg on your own, you can't survive. But it's much deeper than that because we also need people for the companionship. We need to have a sense of belonging. We need to feel like we're part of a community. And so this is something for us to really keep in mind I was going to say something else and it left my mind, but to keep in mind this need to have companionship. Humans thrive best when we are surrounded by other humans. So having said that, I'm going to kind of get into a little more of the meat of the presentation. And I want to start with a poll and ask how many of you have experienced deep loneliness? Now, this isn't being alone. It's not feeling depressed. It's not feeling apathetic. It's feeling like you do not belong, like you have no place to go, like there's no one who really cares about you, like the world would go on without you just fine. This deep sense of, they call it sometimes chronic loneliness. We'll just give this a second for it to fill up. This is, of course, anonymous. We're not tracking who's saying yet what.
I'm seeing in the comments that there's a box in front of your presentation. I think that's just for the poll.
Yeah.
Yeah, the box
is showing the responses on the poll. So I'll go ahead and kind of, I think most people have answered. So we have an almost even split of people who feel they have experienced this sort of deep loneliness and people who haven't. For those of you who haven't, that's wonderful. Nobody should ever feel that kind of loneliness because it's very harmful to us. For those of you who have experienced it, my empathy, I understand what that's like. I have also experienced sort of deep loneliness within my life. And for those of you who are unsure, as we go through this, maybe it will clarify for you, whether this has been an experience you've had or not. So I think I'm clicking through this. Stop sharing. I'll just get rid of this. There we go. So we should be back to, there we go, the presentation. So Dr. Hannah Yang says, deep loneliness can be one of the root causes of other more obvious or easier to identify mental health concerns. It can activate the body's fight or flight mechanism and keep cortisol chronically elevated, leading to inflammatory diseases, based diseases such as heart disease, diabetes, and stroke. So there's a direct correlation towards this sort of deep loneliness and illness, physical illness. There's also connections to mental health concerns. It's a pervasive issue. In fact, in the same article that I took this from, it was saying that deep chronic loneliness can be as impactful as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. It's very harmful to our bodies. So I'm going to just give you a little background on myself. My name's Renee Carterell. I'm a descendant of English, Italian, and Scandinavian immigrants. I'm a sociologist. I also have a PhD in public administration, and I worked in the nonprofit field for about 25 years or so, running different, mostly smaller nonprofits. I'm a grassroots organizer, so I actively work with volunteer communities and building community at the grassroots level. I've been a university professor. I currently am teaching a university class, so I do that off and on. And I'm a passionate believer in compassion because I believe our society has a deficit of compassion, and it's leading to a lot of these chronic kind of loneliness issues that we're seeing. And as I was saying earlier, I was once upon a time very, very lonely. As a youth, my family kind of dissolved on me by the time I was 13, and I didn't have a sense of any place that I belonged. And at the time, I wasn't even really aware that I was that lonely. It was much later in my life that I started to realize how much this loneliness I was feeling at the time impacted me. So I come to this presentation both from a personal lived experience and also from somebody who's studied how our social structures work, how we engage with each other, and how we interact. So deep loneliness is this internal sense of not belonging. And social psychologist Jeffrey Cohen says, a crisis of belonging is destroying us. He says 1 in 5 Americans suffer from chronic loneliness. And in fact, the Surgeon General has a report on loneliness. And this came out of that. He said that young people are struggling with high levels of anxiety and mental health issues at times when they desperately need a sense of connection and belonging. So we have right now an epidemic of loneliness, which is probably part of why we're doing this series, right? And that this crisis of sort of not feeling like, for people of not feeling like they belong, like they are part of something, is extremely harmful to our society, both because it creates this sort of effect on the physically on the person, the mental health concerns, the physical diseases that people can get because of this being in this constant state of anxiety. But chronic loneliness also creates division and hate. It breaks down our social structures. So if you know how sociologists work, we study the structures in society. We don't study independent psychology so much, or we might add some of that in there, but we're more interested in how people build systems, institutions, and structures, and how they interact. And so I'm going to be focusing more than not so much on the individual, but how our social structures are creating this sort of sense of chronic loneliness, which is creating these divisions and hates and these polarizations that we see. It's really important for us to realize that many of us don't do the best job of recognizing when others are feeling lonely and disconnected. In fact, sometimes through our reaction, we actually do the opposite of helping them feel like they belong. We tend to increase the sense of isolation, and we threaten people's sense of belonging. And this is something people are doing kind of without realizing they're doing it. And I'm going to talk about a few different cases where we can kind of see how this is happening. And then I'll tie it all back to polarization. So Professor Christina Ortiz has been doing some studies on what she calls Midwest nice. We tend to, in Minnesota, say Minnesota nice. I don't know if in North Dakota you say North Dakota nice a lot, but I'm a born and raised Minnesotan. But we'll call it Midwest nice here because it's kind of commonality across the Midwest. She says that it's not that people are out there trying to be malicious or mean. It's often not an open rejection of people. It's not directly expressed. In fact, a lot of times people are trying to be kind to people, regardless of whatever the circumstances is. And they tend to try to suppress the urge to speak ill of anybody. This is sort of a characteristic of Midwest nice. But the effect of not feeling like they belong is the same, even though there's no real malice there. So I'm not going to give you her whole presentation. I'm going to give you a little snippet of it. But the part that she talks about before the snippet I'm going to show you is some of the characteristics of Midwest nice. She says there's a tendency to avoid confrontation or direct criticism. There's an assumption of familiarity. So she was talking about leaving a chair, a space in between people in public. So we kind of are distance ourselves just a little bit out of politeness, not out of meanness. We assume familiarity. We'll have small talk with people that we don't know, with strangers. And that's not true in a lot of other cultures. This is a very Midwest culture thing. There's sort of this expectation that the people we're talking to have benign intentions, that they're good people, that they're going to help you, that they want to help, that they're going to like to help you. Not necessarily that they're going to like you, but that they're not going to be malicious. If you ask them for directions, they're going to give you the right directions. They're not going to tell you the wrong way to go. There's a focus on work ethic and this focus on egalitarianism, or she talks about this rejection of conspicuous consumption. So she talks about having if you were well off, you wouldn't have the most flashy car. You'd still drive your old, Ford, banged up Ford, and that's fine, because you don't want to be conspicuous in your consumption. So those are some of the characteristics she points out. Whoops, sorry, that went too far. But there's also some negative characteristics that come out of these sort of cultural behaviors that are part of Midwest nice. What I'm going to do is I have to switch out of my PowerPoint and go to a video. So give me a sec to do that here. And this is Christine. I'm going to share a little piece, and she kind of jumps in right away and talks about this dark side of Midwest nice.
Compartmentalization. So one of the skills that rural community members often have is that, let's say we are at a city council meeting and we totally disagree about something. Maybe we even raise our voices on some kind of issue with one another, right? And then we go to like a church council meeting and it's all the same people, but we're just like, oh, hey, how's it doing? We're talking about this church issue. It's totally separate. We're compartmentalizing these two experiences as completely separate, like genres of life, right? Because we need to get stuff done at church. And I have learned to set aside this city council thing as belonging in the city council space, even though you're the same person, right? And we're the same people. And we might still disagree about that, but we're not talking about it right now. We're talking about something else, right? That is a skill that a lot of rural folks, especially white rural folks, really use effectively to make community. But for people who are from urban communities, or again, BIPOC folks and non-Christian folks who are not from rural communities, that element of Midwest nice can be experienced as like disingenuousness, or what some people have called it. One researcher that I read called it Midwest shady. Right? Because it seems like you're just being false, right? You're purposely being false. And the intentions of that can be read as bad. And certainly that's not what we were meant to do, right? We're trying to avoid conflict. And what we end up doing is being understood as false or fake or shady, right? Hiding our real feelings. And so recognizing that sort of cultural disconnect as cultural and as impactful in our rural communities that have some diversity and people from different places, whether that's, in my community, it's sometimes professors who are coming from urban experiences into this rural community. They're like, Midwest nice is so gross. And I'm like, yeah, I can see how you could get there, right? And so as rural folks, I think we really need to be thoughtful and intentional about how we're using Midwest nice and how it's impacting our relationships.
Okay, I'm going to pause there. Very interesting presentation. If you have a chance, you could go out and take a look at her, what she says, the whole presentation, because she kind of goes into how it becomes kind of exclusionary and people don't feel like they belong necessarily because they come into this situation and they go to a church setting and everyone's really nice to them. And they think, wow, this is a great community. And then nobody talks to them later. Nobody reaches out to them in other settings because that was just something you did at church. That's how you acted at church. There wasn't really an intent to have genuine connection. And so Midwest Nice can serve really important purposes, but it can also create this sort of sense of there isn't really true connections happening, and it can cause some people to feel like they don't belong. So I'm going to pause there for a second and see if there's any comments or questions.
I have not seen any questions. I did see, we do say North Dakota nice, that's true.
Yeah.
So I did see that comment, but I don't see any questions.
Okay, great. We'll keep going on then. So Robin Williams, most of you probably know Robin Williams and that he completed suicide a few years ago. He struggled with depression for many, many years. He said, I used to think the worst thing in life is to end up all alone. He said, it's not. The worst thing in life is to end up with people who make you feel alone. So I think that's just really powerful. And I want to sit with that for just a second to think about how that Midwest nice ties to this sense of that people have of, I'm here with these others and they're friendly, but I still feel so alone because not one of them has ever reached out to me to invite me for lunch or to really show an interest in my life. So Midwest Nice can kind of end up creating this sense of being alone in a crowd. When we feel like we don't belong, we become vulnerable to dangerous and ridiculous beliefs. I love that word, ridiculous, because a lot of times when we see folks who are kind of polarized, we say, how can they believe that? That's so ridiculous. But when we're alone, when we're feeling this sort of chronic loneliness, like we don't belong, people are very vulnerable to these sort of dangerous and ridiculous beliefs because when they start to align with the group that's promoting those beliefs, they get a sense of belonging, and so they tie into those beliefs strongly because the more they kind of follow those beliefs, whether they're ridiculous or not, the more they feel like they belong in that group. And in fact, and this was from Jeffrey Cohn from the Harvard Graduate School. I'm going to just play a little of his clip also. So I have to move over. And this is just an audio clip.
That we have what some call an epidemic of loneliness, wherein roughly 20%, I think, of Americans are so lonely that it poses a health risk, a severe health risk, as bad as smoking a pack of cigarettes a day. So on top of that, Indicators of division are at a high now, such as political polarization. I think hate crimes are roughly at a 10-year high. So the markers of divisiveness, the indicators of isolation, the feeling of being left behind economically, not being part of a community or a country are great now. Also, as workplaces have kind of changed in their nature and they become less of a place where people get meaning and a sort of lifelong sense of belonging and community, phrase to communities, religious associations have opened up. Because of all that, I think it is an apt term for the era we're in. Very few groups feel confident in their sense of belonging. And groups that once did are now a bit unmoored and adrift. So I would say that. And then what the crisis of belonging implies is that it's a crisis, that this matters. Belonging isn't just a touchy-feely construct. It's actually something that, though touchy-feely, has hard consequences. It's associated with physical illness, early death, cardiovascular disease, also vulnerability. There's some exciting research to hate groups and extremist and conspiratorial thinking. When we feel like we don't belong, we become vulnerable to dangerous and ridiculous beliefs with groups that provide us that sense of belonging. So I think, though there are many things contributing to the problems that beleaguer our country now, belonging could be one like sort of underlying symptom or underlying cause that if we address it could have manifold benefits for our society.
Right. All right. Come back to the presentation. So I'm going to give you some examples of how this kind of can play itself out. And I'm going to talk about young men in today's society. And I want to be really clear that when I talk about young men and what's kind of going on with them, this is one example, but they are not the only group impacted by this sort of sense of loneliness and this sense of not belonging. Many, many, many different people experience that. And you all probably are aware of the statistics around suicide, that the group that is most likely to complete suicide are middle-aged white men. You know, so there's this sense of loneliness and not belonging amongst those folks also. But I'm going to talk in particular about young men in our society right now. And I want to talk about the movie Barbie just a bit. When the movie Barbie came out, I was a little confused by it because I'm not a young, that 20 to 30 age graphic anymore. I'm almost a baby boomer, so I'm kind of at the other extreme. And I thought, this movie doesn't resonate with me. I don't understand why this conversation is happening inside this movie or what they're trying to say in this movie. And they were really addressing in the movie this frustration, this division between young women and young men that, you know, you can be seeing Barbie and Ken here. And the sense that, you know, the movie was all about Barbie and Ken didn't really have any role except for to be Barbie's boyfriend. And the struggles that Ken goes through and the polarization and the anger that comes out of Ken as part of that. And when the movie was explained to me that way, it made so much more sense. So in our society today, young women are becoming dramatically more liberal. And I'm not using that in the politicalized sense. Liberal just means they're more empowered. They have more free, sort of free expression of their desires and wants. They can go to school, they can get jobs, they don't have to take on roles that were traditional for women in the past. They're less tied to marriage, they have their own self-worth. And Taylor Swift was kind of an icon of this. She's a 30-something-year-old woman who made it, you know, without a man, you know, doing the work for her. She made it on her own. She's successful in her own right. She's wealthy, and she doesn't need to be married. I assume she's still not married. I haven't followed Taylor Swift for a while, and this was from last year. But she was not married, and she was okay with that. In fact, she said, "I'm quite happy being a middle-aged Catwoman." And the irony of this is, as a woman who was closer to the baby boom generation, the young woman of my day did feel like they had to be married to have self-worth. And that's a huge shift in how young women approach the world today. Of course, we're speaking in generalizations. Not all young women feel that way. But as a trend in the United States, that's the way young women are moving. Young men, on the other hand, are becoming more conservative. They are clinging to the past. They don't want things to change. They want to have the days when women made them the center of their lives. And this is often displaying itself in this sort of misogynistic behavior that is saying women are no good. They're doing terrible things. They should know their place, that sort of thing. I like this quote because it kind of sums it up. To boys who see their fathers as arguably having had life much easier, it's a powerful message. So if you think about the baby boom generation where there was the woman, and we often would talk about women, having two jobs. They'd go to work and then they'd come home and, do the household work. So they were, like they were overburdened with this. But there was still this sense from the men of that older generation that the women were there to take care of them. And of course, young men are kind of resentful that they're not getting what their fathers had, this sort of ability to have someone take care of them. And so I think I'm going to go to a couple of clips here that will kind of exemplify this for you. And then after the clips, I'm going to pause again, so if you have questions. So the first clip is from a man named Andrew Tate. Some of you may be very familiar with him. He's a young man, and he's sort of expressing the young man's point of view. And so I'm going to play this tape, not all the way through, but a chunk of it.
What do you think men want in women?
That's a really good question. And I can answer that one easily. I think that the masculine realm that we operate in is based on respect. I think that men are constantly looking for a way to be respected. I think the world is hyper competitive and we're constantly always looking for status amongst our peers. This is why you will see a man give up his basically entire life to do something which will only gain him respect, even in a very small sphere. There are CEOs who go to work every day and don't even see their family and give up their entire life and work 12-hour days just to feel like the man in that office. Feeling important in that one office, in that one skyscraper, is worth him giving up his life because he feels like he matters. And if he gets more respect in that office than he does at home or anywhere else, that's where he's going to want to be. Men function on that. So if I had to build the ideal woman who could get any man on earth, what she would have to do is understand that I need to give my man as much status and as much respect as possible. I, by extension of him, being next to him, need to make him look respected. And a lot of this is the easy things we know. No one's going to respect a man who's with an ultra promiscuous woman. No one's going to respect a man who's with a woman who's back talking him or horrible to him in public. No one's going to respect a man who's with a woman who clearly isn't interested in him sexually, whatever. That's all the obvious part. But the hidden actual message behind all of it is that men are constantly looking for status and respect, and a woman who makes her man feel respected, not only from her, but from his peers, is the kind of woman a man's never going to want to lose. Right. So if I had a woman and I came home with all 5 of my friends and she came in the house and said, came in the room, who's hungry? Anyone want any food? It's not about food. I'm the G now. I'm the big boss. My woman wants to feed all of us. Of the guys there, most of their chicks would never do that. That's respect. That's status for me. That elevates my status.
Okay, so that's Andrew kind of talking about how, like he's craving this time when women lived to make men have more status, look good to their friends. Their lives kind of revolved around the men in their lives. Here is another clip that kind of talks about this in a little more of a analytical perspective.
But one of the big things I've been worried about recently is young men and how angry they've become, how alone they've become, how isolated they've become, and then ironically, how they've turned that anger, isolation into a community. And it's weird because it's literally there's communities of young men online who have formed communities based in and around loneliness. They don't try and become friends. They don't try and teach each other to hug and to love and to feel and know. They sort of foment these feelings and they go, this is why we should hate women and this is why we should hate the government.
When you find other people who are suffering what you're suffering or who get you, it's incredibly compelling and you feel seen and you feel understood. And the work of Dia Khan, the British documentarian, she talks about this, whether you're talking about white supremacists or we're talking about jihadis, they are not driven by hate, they are driven by love. And this is what we don't understand, which is it's people who are missing love, desperately looking for love, and desperately looking for belonging. And in the world today, I think there's been a total loss of idealism.
Yeah.
You know, our leaders used to talk about world peace and peace on earth. You and I having a conversation about world peace right now would sound cheesy and corny and weird. And I think there's been a loss of idealism. And when there's a loss of idealism and something to feel like we belong to larger than ourselves, larger than our nation, larger than the work that we do, if that's missing, we still look for that. We still look for that belonging, but unfortunately we find it down here. And I think we're witnessing the loss of idealism in the world right now, how we're finding community at low levels and tearing each other apart.
Okay, so let me get out of this. Back to the PowerPoint. So were there any questions or comments that people wanted to make on that?
I do see some, Renee. So there's a question about nursing homes turning a social person into someone suffering from isolation due to being forced away from their normal support systems. I don't know if there's anything you want to speak to there.
Well, so I'm a huge supporter of planned communities for people as they age, because I think the opposite can be true too. I've seen a lot of elders who are in their homes that they lived in for 40 years and they don't want to leave them and they're isolated there and there's nobody there for them. So I think it can happen in any situation. I think that what you're picking out is symptoms of a deeper crisis, that, you know, instead of creating living situations where people feel vibrant till the end of their life, we're creating living situations where elders are becoming isolated because we don't really see them as having any value anymore. They're at the end of their life and we just have to take care of them and they need all this medical help and there's no value left in them. And so instead of figuring out how to kind of provide a society that you know values their life also and creates a system where, you know, they can thrive as elder people, you know, we just kind of let them float off until they go away. I actually kind of dislike the term, well, it was for the best that they passed on. They just were so ill towards the end and sometimes that's true. So I don't want to discredit that sometimes somebody's suffering from a lot of pain, but sometimes I think we just kind of leave our elders to kind of get to the state where their life is so miserable. Yeah, they don't have much to live for anymore, but we could have done something to prevent that. And our society is just not set up for that.
Absolutely.
Hopefully that helps.
Yes. There's another question. Was there a significant increase in loneliness and isolation specifically within the last 5 years?
It feels like it because of the partisanism, right? I think it's been building for a long time. Cultural trends tend to take 40 years to grow. Things don't just happen overnight. So I think what we're seeing is sort of this peak that started happening after the 60s. So if you look at sort of historically what was happening around the 60s, it was coming out of World War II. There was this strong sense of community and this higher purpose to the community. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. All of that was really strong in the 50s leading up into the 60s. And we kind of hit that peak about 65. And there's some books that talk about that, like Robert Putnam's The Upswing. And then that can become cloying and claustrophobic too. And the younger generation at that point, the baby boomers I was referencing, kind of started saying, no, I don't want to just go down the same path as my parents. I don't want to be conformed into this community that you say I have to live in. I want to branch out and explore my new communities. And so we started moving away from that. And I'm really simplifying it because there were so many other dynamics happening. But I think over time, we've kind of just reached this peak of individualism now that's moved so far away from communitarianism that we're having the opposite problem. We're not having people feel like they're stuck in communities and having to conform inside communities. We're having people feel like they have no community. And that took, more than 40 years. It took many years to happen. But there's some pretty clear literature out there that says that things happen in 40-year cycles. Well, no, I'll say this differently. Things take about 40 years to sort of play out, and cultural changes take about 40 years to happen.
There's another one from Jenna. With the development of the economy, it seems as though the women are now occupying roles that men have traditionally previously been responsible for, which plays out in a role crisis for most men because they may feel inadequate in what they have to offer women or their partners.
Yeah. And this has been going on for a while, right? More women go to college than men. Women have sort of had this great awakening, and this potential for them has been huge, and they've been excited to take it. And there hasn't been a similar sort of mechanism to give men a view of the future that could be different. We haven't sort of nurtured this idea that, of what could be new and better for men. So all they've experienced is the loss of sort of having this sort of traditional family life in which women took care of them. And we haven't replaced it with anything. Let me go on a little longer and then we can look at some more questions because I don't want to run out of time. And there's still some more things. Yeah, we're getting 20 minutes away. So, we pretty much talked about this. Young men feel as though they've lost status and power, that they don't belong anywhere. And this is kind of this vicious cycle. The more isolated these young men feel, the more they kind of act out and get angry at everyone around them, the more they cling to the online communities or echo chambers that are echoing their frustrations. So you have somebody who feels like they don't belong, like life doesn't offer them much opportunity, and then they're feeling this isolation, so they go online and hear other people saying that. But instead of kind of coming up with how you can make things better for each other, they just kind of are echoing their frustrations back and forth. And they're reinforcing these sort of frustrations that they're having. So I'm going to switch focuses a little bit now and talk about in-group and out-groups. Because I think this is, as a sociologist, this is part of the situation that's happening. Remember, I talked just a minute ago about the 50s. The 50s were very strong in community, but they also had these incredible in-groups. You had to belong to the in-group. And that was the rebellion that people had. No, I don't want to conform to your, sort of to white picket fence house ideal. I want something different. And in-groups exist by identifying themselves as different than out-groups. So we're the in-group. We believe we have these sort of beliefs and ideas, like the young men who are in the echo chambers talking about their frustrations. They have an in-group, and they identify themselves in opposition to the outgroups, those others, the women who are making them feel this way, or the parents that didn't understand them, or whatever other outgroups are out there. So one of the dangers in human society is the formation of these in-groups that kind of grow into sort of rigid communities that outcast other groups and don't accept and don't understand other groups. It's sort of the opposite of inclusivity. We've got our in-group and we are exclusive. We don't include everybody in it. And there's something that makes people feel good to be part of that. What better way to feel part of a community than to feel you're part of that in-group? And that those folks aren't, and I've got to be in this in-group, and I feel really good because I'm not one of those people. I've heard that actually said, I know that I wouldn't want to be one of those people. I'm in here, I feel good about it. And the powerful thing is that when you're craving that, you cling to that in group. And you'll glom onto it and kind of reject those on the out group. And this doesn't have to be, like something people are even conscious of doing it. It doesn't have to be like you can name all the members of the group. There's no membership list. You just know, and we'll talk a minute about words and language. You just know that people who are in your group and who aren't in your group by how they talk to each other and how they interact and the things they do. And so if we go back to Midwest Nice, a lot of times people, in the in-group, no, well, we're in church, we just do this. And then people who come into church and don't use the right words or do the right things, they're really not part of our group. And so then they're alienated from us. They don't belong. This us versus them sense kind of deepens these divides. Well, definitely deepens these divides. It promotes distrust, but it also rallies followers and it justifies the behavior in these in-groups because as you're embedded inside of these, it becomes more and more important to cling to these things. What this also does is it distracts people from more pressing systemic issues. So somebody asked, is it worse today? Well, one thing that's really bad today is our economic situation. Inequality from the 1960s to today has grown immensely. People are falling out of the middle class. There's more poor people. There's more homelessness, especially in the last few years. The homelessness is rising incredibly. We had COVID that created a lot of problems in so many places in our society. And so, our society is not functioning as well as it used to. And so you're going to see people looking for a way to get away from that pain, and sometimes they find it in these in-groups. It also makes it, when you have these sort of situations where the world outside is not very healthy and people are finding some belonging and good things inside of that group, it can make it easier for external forces to exert influence. So someone can come into that in-group, talk the right way, and really sway the in-group into an extremist in-group, and sort of radicalize the in-group. So I just was listening to a book called Cultish, The Language of Fanaticism by Amanda Montell. And I literally just was listening to it just this month, and somebody had recommended it. And I thought, this is so relevant to this conversation here, because she was talking about sort of cultish behavior. Now, we all have these stereotypes about what a cult is, that a cult is, some religious fanatic group with a charismatic leader that's going to give his followers Kool-Aid if they don't conform, or lock them inside and they can't leave. And that does happen sometimes. Those are sort of the extreme. But Amanda says that cultish behavior is very common, and that those are actually the extremes, that we see cultish behavior all around us all the time. From yoga classes, she talks about yoga classes, to CrossFit. I was talking to someone about Peloton, I forget the bicycle name. There's informal religious groups, which I mean, when I say that we don't really recognize them as religious groups, or they're kind of fringy religious groups, self-help organizations, corporate culture. And in all these different places where this cultish behavior is happening, language is the key. It's what builds the identity. They use unique words and ways of describing the world that's important to building this in-group mentality. So if you're in CrossFit, you talk about, the type of clothing you get, and you only get that kind of clothing. And if someone shows up wearing a different type of clothing, then they're not part of the in-group. And you have to do so many exercise activities a week, and if you don't show up one day, then you're looked at suspiciously and maybe outside the in-group. Or another phrase person was talking about, it might have been in the book, about going to, the author had gone to evangelical religious ceremonies, or not ceremonies, but the church on Sunday, and heard all these sort of in-group ways of talking about being together. And she would imitate them, and they would accept her more easily because she was imitating their language and the ways they did things. So she says language is really key to this cultish behavior, and it's all around us. And she says we should stop thinking of it as brainwashing. We don't say a soldier was brainwashed to go out and learn how to shoot a weapon. We say they were trained. People are trained how to be in these in-groups, and they are given they are given the words and the ways of coming together that help them understand that in group. And the more they conform to it, the more they are accepted into that group. And a lot of times what will happen with really extremist groups is that they'll have the outer circle where they'll have some of this language out there, and it really resonates with people. But then the closer you get to the circle, to the in-group, to where you're really part of that in-group, the more they'll use the actual kind of extremist words, like she was talking about the cult Georgetown, it's not Georgetown, the cult that killed itself down in Ghana, Jonestown. They would talk more and more about sort of these white knights, where they talk about sacrificing themselves for the betterment of the world, and that eventually led to, of course, some of them being forced to, but a lot of them, drinking the Powerade that killed them, or it wasn't Powerade, the Kool-Aid type drink that killed them. So really interesting book if you're interested in that topic. And so what we're really talking about here, if you're an English major, is rhetoric, which is aimed at vulnerable people. So people who are feeling like they don't belong somewhere, who are on the out group, who don't, or are not even in a group, who feel isolated. This rhetoric is aimed at them, trying to bring them in. And this was an example I got from last year. I think it's really interesting because we have these stereotypes in our head. And one of my stereotypes was, like the Eastern religions are somehow more peaceful and loving. And so then I read about how in Myanmar, these Buddhist monks were talking about the Rohingya refugees who were Muslim, in these really awful terms, calling them cockroaches and insects, and that it didn't matter if they died. And I'm like, this doesn't jive with what I see a Buddhist religion being. And of course, not all Buddhist religions are that way, but this particular Buddhist group had become more and more radicalized. And one of the key things they were doing was to create this in-group of them versus the out-group of, in this case, the Muslim people from the Rohingya culture. And they even would say things like, for women, it is better to marry dogs than Muslims, etc. So this can spring up in all sorts of different ways. I'm just going to really briefly touch on this. There's sort of 6 constructed hate speech narratives. That reinforce this sort of, this was all about the sort of, I should have taken this out, the Buddhist element there. So they kind of came up with how they use these sort of hate speech narratives to kind of create this in-group and like kind of exclude others from it. And so they kind of use these key words to kind of justify their behavior. And included in this is identifying them as violent and taking over from us, and that we need to protect our woman, and that we have to have military strength, and There's this misinformed international community that we have to help, and that there's these traitors, and they use these sort of inflammatory words. And probably some of you can think of how these words have been used in other situations to kind of justify the behavior that was happening. So when a person chooses to align in a community of hate, it is very self-destructive for it. It creates fear in the individual, the fear that they're going to be rejected, the fear that someone's going to figure out that maybe they're going to be somehow called out for their behavior. And the more that the person fears, the more one builds hate rooted in that fear. So it's really, really easy to start looking at the person who's building more and more of a sense of hate as being harmful and bad, but they're actually a victim of this sort of rhetoric, of this sort of characteristic of how humans sometimes create these sort of in-groups that can be really radicalized. And it's really easy for us to blame that victim and say that person is listening to ridiculous ideas, and why can't they see the truth? And in a lot of ways, that person is also is a victim. It's they're doing harmful things, but they're doing it not because they're crazy or because they're silly. They're doing it out of this place of fear and trauma. So hate is the memory of violence perpetuated by another person who invalidated my personhood. Let me take a drink. So let's break that down. Hate is this memory of violence. Now, violence we often think of as physical violence, but sometimes violence is words. So hate is this memory of something happening to you physically, emotionally, verbally, that was perpetuated on you by another person who invalidated your personhood. So this other person caused you to feel like you didn't belong, that you weren't good enough, that you weren't a person, that you weren't capable of being part of their community. And out of that springs this hate. And if you see the reactions of people in these sort of hate groups, in these polarized groups where they're seeing anybody outside of their in-group as bad, if you see that behavior as a trauma response to this sense of not belonging somewhere, they're joining these groups because they don't feel a sense of belonging. If you see that as a trauma response, it totally changes the way you start to interact with people who are going down these rabbit holes into sort of extremism. But hate and division, I'm just going to double check the time. Oh my gosh, it's 1. I'll just leave you with this. Hate and division are not natural. It is not human nature to create hate and division. Certain forms of leadership ferment and thrive on extreme polarization. They get a lot of benefits from it. A lot of times they get money. Cult leaders get very popular. They have power, all those things. And so the answer is that research indicates that divisiveness will continue to grow if fear of the other and wounds feeling that fear are not addressed. What we need to do, Jeffrey Cohen suggests, and I'm a big supporter of that, is to build compassion. So I'm going to stop sharing because I'm out of time. Should have given me a warning. And I'm happy to stay a little bit if there's time to stay. But
sorry, that was on me. I wasn't watching the clock. I was watching the presentation.
Oh, it's okay. I looked and I'm like, oh my gosh, it's 1.
I'm so sorry. Yes, the people.
But that was basically the end. I was just going to kind of end with a more uplifting note because, and I think compassion is what we do. We approach people who are feeling this anger and are so polarized, and we need to give them compassion back.
So hopefully everyone can see the evaluation link there. I believe I have the right screen. Yeah, that was fantastic. I have so many thoughts going in my head about all the examples and everything. There was a lot of comments thinking back to COVID. I think when we think isolation and loneliness, what better not in a good way, but there's not a better example of those feelings than when we went through the pandemic. So I did see that. Lots of thank yous coming through. Wish the session could have been longer. I know, I know. I think that's a recurring theme here. I do want to remind everyone, oh, this slide says you're coming back next week.
Oh,
That
I
is not
wasn't
true.
planning to.
We're actually taking a break next week because so many people will be enjoying hopefully beautiful weather for the holiday. And then we'll be back July 8th with Dr. Meg McKelvey presenting on belonging from the inside out. There's just so many thank yous coming in.
Thank you,
So
everyone.
yeah, so we will go ahead and end for the day. We appreciate everyone so much. And thank you so much, Renee. It was really
You're welcome.
fascinating.